And this is what we will be painting. Now this way we could practice doing a sphere, and then also texture, and then just real light subtle color changes that will be required to do this old softball. Now I used this softball for a pen and ink digital demo that I thought worked really well, so I'll use it again, but this time it will be for color, and then we'll create our textures and spherical shape with the glazing acrylics. So what I want to do first is, if I want to just take this panel and gradate it from, just say for example, a light to medium blue down to a gray, then what I want to do is pre-mix those colors. This will help a lot. The colors I'm going to use, I already have pre-mixed. This is a 2-ounce jar. These are 1-ounce jars. There's the color I'm going to start with. Now to gradate colors, then what I want to do is take it down to this color here, and that's a little wee bit darker. Now if you have a big area to do this with, what we're going to do is use a sponge, and the more gradations you have, the more variations of the color change you have, the easier it will be to blend. Now what I'm going to use is just a regular Ocello Scotch-Brite sponge, but what I did, I cut it into quarters, but then what I also did was took this quarter and rounded it just with scissors. This way, if I use a smaller sponge like this to do my gradation change, as you will see here shortly, I may get right angles with this particular cut sponge. If I use this, then it's almost like a daub. I'll get more of an even, nicer mix blending when it's wet and I'm using the paint right off the glass. Now what I'll do is dampen this first and then take some of these two colors and blend them. But what I want to do first is get myself there as close as I can with a brush, and I'll glaze it that way, and then I'll go back over with the sponge. Because what will happen is we're using our paints somewhat thin, almost like watercolors, to the point where one coat would never be enough. So I have to build up those layers to get myself a nice solid blue. But one thing nice about keeping your colors mixed, that once you start doing paintings that require that background, and you want an atmospheric change from a light blue sky in the background down to some distant mountains, then you already have that color mixed, and you could always go back to that same color, because acrylics to a certain extent are the opposite of watercolors. They will dry a little bit darker. So trying to match a color perfectly if you don't already have it pre-mixed is very difficult. There may be a very subtle color change that where you just can't mix the exact color that you had before. Let's go ahead and take this wrapper off, and we're going to get started with our pencil drawing that I made a layout of the softball, and then we're going to trace it down with graphite paper and get started. Okay, just to give you a rough idea how long I had this little 8x10 panel, when I take off the label, it actually has a mark on where the label was. So the panel yellowed a little bit, but I did have it quite some time. I just never used a little 8x10. But for this particular demo, it should work good. Now what I did was made a layout. I just use either layout paper or, in this case, tracing paper. I think it works a lot better. I really like to make layouts. You'll see through all of my paintings when I make separate drawings, then this way I can move it around on a background that may have trees, foliage, whatever, to make sure nothing is going to cause problems for the subject that will be up against the background. In this particular case, it's pretty much straightforward. And what I will do is just tape it about right there. And then we are just going to trace this out with an ink pen. I just use a regular ballpoint ink pen, which works really good on the paper, because then if I use black on top of the graphite, not only will I know what all I traced out, but then the roller ball does a really good job of just pushing down on the paper and marking it with graphite. The graphite paper is just made by Cyril. This is it right here, just wax-free. Cyril transfer, there's graphite. And there's also white, red, different colors if you need it to go back over other colors. But in this case, this is just a graphite color. And we will just put this right underneath here like this. And what I will do is trace this out, but we'll just do that speed. Again, keeping a drawing handy will always give me the opportunity to go back and retrace my original drawing if I need it. This way, if I paint over something, I'll always have it. Okay, now what I noticed in our photograph is that the top of it is a little bit darker, which will be great, only because to have a nice highlight on our softball, to have light, you have to have dark. So what I'll do is create the top a little wee bit darker, and that will be this color right here. This is a darker gray. If you could see it down in the jar, it's a fairly dark gray. I'll start with that color, then go to our lighter gray, which would be right here, the bluish gray, and then back down to a little wee bit darker gray, which would be about a middle gray. So in other words, I'm going to go, this will be the top, this will be the middle, and this will be the bottom. This way it'll go from dark to light to medium. And then I will be able to make my shadow, which will probably be darker yet, and what I would be able to start with would be my top color, and I could even go from there and make it even darker. But as long as I have those colors ready to go, then I could start mixing and blending in exactly the color that's already there. Now once I start gradating it, then these areas will be different. And what I mean by that is they will have variations of both colors together, so I can't take a straight color straight back to those areas because it will be different because of the two colors mixed. Now let's go ahead and paint this in. Now this right here, I have a shadow just roughed in. Now since I have my pencil drawing, then what I could do is just bring the pencil drawing back over and put it over the painted background, and if I want to, I could redraw my shadow over the paint and give me a good idea where the shadow will be. Now if you want to just start painting and start doing a shadow, that's fine. But the way I paint, the animals I create, and the type of subject matter I do, and the reasons I do it for, require a fairly accurate, thought out subject and background. So that way I like to start with a pencil drawing and then go from there. It saves me a good bit of time rather than just keep repainting something over and over. To a certain extent I will do that, but only in situations where proportions and the colors and everything else may not be as critical as what I'm changing back and forth. Let's go ahead and paint this in. Okay, we're going to start with this one. Now this one, because of how small this painting is, we can almost do it with a brush. But we'll use a sponge just to help us out a little bit. We'll go to that, and then we'll go to the medium value at the very bottom. This way this will give us a nice darker color up on top, so we can make a real nice stronger highlight on our softball. Now what I want to do is I'll just mist this down a little bit. Mist the paint just once. And then I will pull out some paint. And again, remember, this is going to take several coats. And then all those paint brush marks will disappear. And remember, we can't go any darker than the color we've already mixed, so that helps us out a lot. And this, we don't have to be too worried about brush strokes right now because this will get covered up several times. What I want to do is just try and keep any buildup, keep away from that. So I just want a real smooth surface to end up with. Now again, being that I already have this color mixed, as long as I go back to that same color, it won't matter. Now we'll start the light blue. I get a little bit of water on it. And I will keep a paper towel on my lap ready to go. What I can do, if I take this down just to the lighter blue, I can go right into it with the medium color that will be down at the very bottom. Let's move this just a little bit. And now I'm just going to use just about the straight blue, real light blue. And again, if I cover up the shadow, then this is where I could go back over with my layout and redo it if I want the exact shadow there. Take it down to about right in here. Okay, now that I got my line of light blue going across, take it down a little wee bit further. We'll cover up that mark from the label also. Now we'll go to the medium gray. I'm working quick to try and take advantage of mixing the paints while they're still wet. That will definitely help with the gradation process. But having the colors mixed fairly close together in value will also help. And we're doing this all in real time. Now I'll just go straight to the gray. And I put a little stick under there just to lift it up so I can do the very edge. And once you pre-mix colors like that, if it's a pretty common color or value, they will stay a long time in those jars. And there's where I'm just lightly glazing over it. And we got to leave this dry really good, because if we don't, this is where some artists may say that if you don't think acrylics are workable, in other words, if you think they dry too quick, sometimes they don't dry quick enough, because now we're done with this. We have to leave this dry completely. If we don't, if I start painting up here now, what I'll do is just start pushing that around, sludging it around, and it'll get really messy. Then that way it'll be harder to cover, because you'll get what I would call divots of white in that darker area. So we got to leave this dry really good, and then do the same thing over 1 or 2 more times, and then go to a sponge, and it will really diffuse our gradation really nice. Let's go ahead and leave this dry, and we'll be back to it. Okay, I went ahead and hit that with a hair dryer, just like watercolors. It's nice and dry. It'll dry pretty quick because the first coat on the somewhat porous gesso sucks it up pretty good pretty quick. Now I'll go ahead and do the exact same thing again, but we'll do this one speed painting. When blending with a brush, the size of the brush you use makes all the difference in the world. Use as large of a brush as you can, but here I'm using a little bit of a smaller brush so I can work up against the softball and keep my line as accurate as possible without having to go over it. Okay, let's go into round 3. I dried this coat good, and as long as I push on it, it doesn't stick to my hand, it should be ready to go. And right now I'm just going to do the exact same thing again. You can see it slowly covering up. We'll have that light blue band going across, and that's where we'll put our shadow, right down in here. And then this darker area up in here, I think that'll work nice, that I'll have a nice strong highlight on our sphere. Let's go ahead and do another speed coat of the exact same thing. There are quite a few variables that will determine how many coats you may need. One is the amount of water you use with your paint that will thin it out and make it more transparent. And then even the type of the surface you're working on can make a difference also. Okay, we got this one dry also. This is the 3rd coat already. You could see how it's already starting to cover good. I could still see a little wee bit of daylight here, but we'll go ahead and soften that up too. Now what I'm going to do is start with the sponge and then just use the same colors, but when I use the sponge, I will eliminate the brush strokes. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead out and pull out some paint of these colors. I'll just try and have enough ready just to get me started. And again, mix in as many variations as you can of the different color values. Makes it a lot easier to blend too. Water helps, and then the sponge will help also. But this is if you want just about an airbrush effect with acrylics. Okay, we'll get a little bit of our same colors we've been using. Let me clean a brush because it's going to be sitting a while. Okay, I just damp sponged and we're ready to go. Now what I'll do is start up here. Give ourselves a little bit more room. And I'm sliding at the same time. I'm dabbing it too, just so I don't get any sponge marks, so to speak. And this will be, and then you could also use a natural sponge if you do want a very subtle texture. Spoiler alert, that's what I'll be doing in the first demo. And when I start with my original colors, I don't have to worry about, this is already dry over here, so I don't have to worry about that. Get a little bit of water. I'll wet down the sponge just a little bit more. If I want to feather that back into the light, I'll just grab a little bit of dark, take it back down. All I'm doing is going back and forth. Light to dark, dark to light. One nice thing about acrylics is because they dry so quick, you never need to panic. There's always some way you could fix an ongoing painting so you don't lose the entire piece. You can see sponge marks here just barely, but once those start to dry, they're going to darken up. So I have to be patient and see what I end up with once it starts to dry a little bit. And again, I'm going from my dark to my light, then back to my medium. That's more of a drastic change also. Using this Ocello sponge will give me a very subtle texture. Using a car sponge will just about eliminate texture altogether. It will depend on what you want. I'll rinse out the sponge just a little bit. Using sponges with acrylics is very similar to using a sponge with watercolors. However, the big difference is you could take lighter colors back over darker areas to create or render different types of foliage and textures that you may be looking for. As you can see, it's much easier taking the medium into the light than it is the dark into light. That's a much more abrupt change. It'll take a little bit more work, but you don't have to panic in acrylics. The surface of the sponge will pretty much dictate what kind of pattern or effect you'll get. The advantage of a sponge is an end result that's quite different than a brush. No right angle, so I'm okay. Now if I take the medium color into the dark first, a little bit easier to make that transition. Okay, let's go with that for now. We'll leave that dry good and see what we get. Okay, we'll touch this up just a little bit, and that might be it. What I'll do is just start with this color here, my dark. I better put more out. And I'm going to take it to the medium first. I'm trying to see off the glare of the paint too from the lights. Using the Ocello sponge I have now will give me a subtle texture because of the small air pockets in the sponge itself. See if we can blend it into what's there. That's not too bad. Go back over to here. That one's not too bad at all. Looking around. Okay, we're going to go with that. Okay, it's dry enough to start with, but what we'll do is we'll lay out our colors first. This is going to be a really good color to use for this, and that is unbleached titanium. It's kind of like a real subtle beige, if you will. We'll start with that one, And what I could do actually is just work with this one alone, because what I want to do is create my circle that I want to eliminate those dark grays or any other colors or edges that will be a part of my softball. So what I'll do is start off with a coat of the unbleached titanium just to mark in where my softball is going to be, and then I could even start putting the strings in real dark, and that will give me an idea where those are, and then start glazing in all my colors as we go. Let's go ahead and just do this speed painting, because all I'm going to do is take my unbleached and go around the circle and just give myself a little bit of a starting point as a base coat. This particular demonstration is just a study of glazing techniques with acrylics. There are many ways to paint with acrylics. This is just one of them. Working with glazing techniques, it is important to know that every layer you put down will determine a specific outcome at the very end. Knowing what layers to place and how to end your sequence will make a difference in your final result. Just to start shading it in already, just to give me a good start, I'll have to make this darker down here, but that won't be no problem at all. But then it has a real subtle glossy glaze over it from the reflection. And then I'm going to put in the strings first, and then I can even start the shadow. But the shadow up here, it's going up the side of the paper, because what I did was I put a piece of paper like this and made it a horizonless background. So all I did was took a piece of paper, laid it down, and then put it up against something, and then put the ball down on that, and then that just gave me that horizonless background. There's no line going across as like the edge of a table or anything like that. So the shadow will put it in place, make it look like it's sitting on something, but right now it's just floating in space. Let's go ahead and let that dry good, and then we'll keep working. Okay, I tried to zoom in as much as I could just to keep the paints and the softball as big as possible within the picture. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and just rough in these strings, and then this way, if you want to start off with any specific value of anything you're doing within a painting, sometimes it's safe to just start off with medium values, and then you could go lighter above that or darker below that. This way, if you start off with a real dark color, then you may have to make it quite a bit lighter, and that's a little wee bit tougher, again, trying to gradate a real light to a real dark, or vice versa. Now, what I'm going to do is just pull out some paint, and these are just my background colors, so there's nothing special here. If I get too much paint on my brush, or if I think it's just a little bit out of control because of dipping it in, because right now I can't see down in my jars just to have it up in the picture. So what I do is even just clean it off a little bit and then go from there. Now let's go ahead and put just the strings in, just to keep them there so we don't lose them. And again, they are going to vary in color. We can make them a little wee bit darker down in the shadowed areas, and then obviously a little bit lighter. But they are still fairly dark. Since I'm familiar with this softball, it originally had blue stitches on, but we could put a real subtle hint of blue somewhere in it if we want to. And this is where there is a subtle dent, if you will, where the two sides of the leather come together. And then we'll get technical enough that once we start getting going, I will make a very small pinhole where the string is going down in to the leather itself. But again, the amount of details you want to hold is up to you. I am used to putting in a good bit of detail, because I know from my own experience, somebody will notice it. In this case, those that are familiar with a softball. What makes some of these lines a little bit longer than others is that hole is a little bit more obvious in some places. But after these guys get hit around a while, they will even start to deform in shape and size. I made this little pencil mark right here. These right here, that's where a real strong highlight's going to be of where the leather is pulled together. I kind of like to know what's going on with anything I paint. Hit it with a little bit of water. Now, working like this with a glazing technique, half of your battle is going to be the type of consistency of the paint you're putting down. Now, if I put it down too thin, it's not going to cover very good, but you'll just require maybe an extra coat. I don't want that one there. I'll move it over just a little bit. They're starting to run together just about. Pretty much foreshortened. We'll end that side like that. One way up here. Put this side in first, and it'll tell me where the other side should be. Again, we'll foreshorten them. Get a good bit closer together as they go around the ball. The spacing will be different. We'll end that one right there. And then these are going to go off on this angle. I want to try and make it look like they're on a rounded surface too. But again, when glazing, the painting will have a lot to do with the consistency of your paint. If you want to cover something in a hurry, if you have it thick, that will work good. But just be aware it's going to be hard to blend because it'll be, or I should say it could be, sludgy. You're trying to take one hue to another very quickly. Okay, let's start putting in some of our other colors. I'll clean this up a little bit. Okay, let's start blocking in some of our colors up in here. This is already dry and it's only been a few minutes. You can see I can even put later on a couple strings way up in here going over that way as it comes right around the very edge. We're going to put some shapes down in here, and again we'll just take it back and forth from light to dark and then dark to light back again. And we can even put some straight colors down if you want, because remember, this is just a glazing technique, and all of the colors that you're using before will come through. Now if I clean off the brush, I could work that in a little bit, and from my experience I never had problems with paint lifting off or anything because it was too thin. Remember, I'm not going to walk on this thing like I actually do my backdrops. But then also, right now, I'm already starting to try to build a very subtle texture on that beat up leather ball. And I just rinsed out the brush a little bit. There's very little water on the brush now, but just enough that I can move the paint around without smearing it or smudging it. And this will get me started with my shading and my textures. And again, a lot of these areas have to go a good bit darker, and then I'll even put some textures back over here and then take white back over it, because that the layer before that will still come through and just add more complexity to what I'm trying to do. Again, clean off the brush a little bit, just daub away, and I can start a subtle texture. And if the texture is too strong, I could definitely cut it back by taking a glaze back over it, because the more layers you give whatever you're trying to render, what you'll do is start to cut back on the contrast and make all the values closer together by giving it additional layers of paint. We'll put that dark spot up here next. I'll use a little wee bit of burnt umber for that. I can even go to a little wee bit of blue if I want to. This gray might be dark enough, but we'll just go by the photo just so you know what I'm trying to do. And again, these blends here do not have to be perfect, because I could take white back over them, which I will anyway, because I want to create a subtle stipple effect, and it'll just add to the texture. Oh, I forgot my unbleached white. I will need it. This is a really good color to use for this particular painting. Now if I start taking this new mix of paints back over what I just put down, not only will it lighten it up, it'll start to diffuse the amount of texture I have there. It's going to be a little bit too much water. As I think I said before, I will keep a paper towel on my lap and just daub the brush if I feel I have too much water on it, which I do. And you can even see how it's darker on some of these areas between the strings, only because it's a higher part of the ball, which would definitely get slammed by the bat more often. Okay, now I'm going to darken this up. I'll give it just another coat of a darker right down through here. It's not dark enough. It's getting a little bit too dry for me, so I'm going to wet it off, wring out the water off the brush, and now I could blend it a little bit easier. And again, I want to leave a very subtle texture behind. That's going to be the leather itself. But if you take a little bit at a time, and the more layers you do, the easier it will be to blend. And you can see how much paint I'm using at a time. That's why I choose to use the bottle method, in jars I should say. And again, I'm just stippling to try and keep my leather texture alive. And we're going to make between the strings a little bit darker. And then if these have some reflected light coming up, I can lighten them up with a real subtle coat. This is my thin white. Just to give you a heads up on that, I won't need my heavy white probably anymore for this particular painting. And oddly enough, having paint on the brush but then sticking it in a different color, I never had too much problem with contaminating the colors. It seems like the new color goes right around the brush and you pull it out with it, and the old color might still be inside on the brush. Just like that. So I don't worry about contaminating my colors either, unless there's a whole bunch of paint on them. And I'll daub it off before I take it to the jar. It's still saving me a lot of paint compared to squirting it out. Now if I barely touch down, I can lighten my value a little bit. And I'm intentionally going up this way because I'm starting to run out of paint, but at the same time I need a lighter value anyway. So that just kind of comes with experience of how much paint you got on your brush and what you need to paint. Okay, to the other side. It will have a reflection on it, but we'll start with some darker touch of brown. And then we'll put the darker line that's in between the two pieces of leather very last. And we'll definitely take some white back over this here and there. Very subtle like. But it's almost like watercolors too, in a way that if I know there's a little bit of white beside each string, then I don't need to take it all the way to each string. I could leave a little bit of white behind too. Save yourself some time and troubles trying to cover color that you didn't need to begin with. And this is just a little bit beat up leather here, not necessarily shading. Okay, let's put our heavy duty shadow in now. I'm going to break out a little bit of blue for that. It will be just right on the other side, right here. First, I'll mix a deeper gray. Okay, that's pretty thick. Again, I'd rather take it a little bit at a time. That way I can also try and stay with my texture that I'm looking for at the same time. Again, this is only the second coat of paint, so I wouldn't get too excited yet. Yeah, it didn't go bad. That went down okay right from the start. A little bit of water in it. Grab a little bit of water. Okay, let's let that dry. Okay, I'm going to just rough in my shadow, but I'm just going to make it a little bit different than the photograph. Instead of the shadow going up the back of the paper, I'm just going to make it like a typical shadow. We'll just lightly pencil it in, just to help us out a little bit. And this is where the edge of this is where I'll probably start to feather it out into what's there, because I'm not going to have a real hard edge. It will be a little bit on the softer side. We'll go with that for now. And then I'm just going to use these same grays to start it. And I will use the same brush I have been using. Actually, I'll grab a little bit bigger one. Mist it down just a little bit. I'm going to start to transition slow. Now, since I already have this color mixed, I could just pick up right where I left off as long as it's going to be the same value. That's just to get me started. Because what I'll do is change the darkness back in here. We'll make that darker. And again, it'll take a couple layers of paint. But if we do it in layers, it'll be easier to blend. And I'll leave the ball alone, because if I want to change its values, I'll do it on the ball, of course. If I want to start changing, making it a little wee bit lighter. Blend in the colors just to help myself out with the transition. And if I get any overlapping lines like this where one area I may have two coats and all the rest of the shadow I only have one coat, that doesn't matter, because that will even up as I give it one or two more coats, because it's a pre-mixed color and it will always end up that color once it dries. Okay, we gotta let that dry really good before we go over with another coat. We'll leave it there for now. We could feather it out a little bit further, but we'll do that with the next couple coats. And I'm also going to go ahead and start with more of the ball. Get on some new colors here. If you notice, there's a red, a little bit of a red right in here, and that's probably from a bat that the paint actually came off on the ball, so somebody hit it pretty hard. My point would be is I'd rather put that reddish gray down now and then take white over it, because the reflection is coming off the very outer surface of the ball itself. So if I put the white over it, it'll look like the reflection is the furthest most out color value. I'm going to put in the darker values too. I'm going to mix in just a little bit of our... Oh, we're going to go to a small brush for this. Again, I'm running out of paint, which is what I need. Make it a little bit lighter. And then we'll probably go back over it with white. I don't want this to be a straight line. It's zigzagging back and forth. medium-sized brush. Let's go back to our shadow. Okay, now what I could do is lighten some of this up with the blues, real light, and then also darken this up back in here. And if I want to straighten out the shadow itself, as long as I have these blues mixed up, which is this one and this one, then I could possibly go back in and take out a little bit of the shadow if I want to, because it's all going to be a soft edge anyway. But we'll leave it like that for now. We'll leave that dry good, and then we'll go back to it and start working on the ball itself and then the shadow also. And we'll give it a chance, but I could even feather out some real light color right around in here. Let's leave it dry. Okay, I'm going to darken this up a little bit. I hit it with the hair dryer. We'll leave it sit a while. I'm going to darken this up right in here. Move my highlight right into here since the shadow is a little bit off center. Yep, I need my unbleached titanium again. Okay, I'll use my Acrylic mixed with a little bit of brown just to tone it down a little bit so it's not a real vibrant red. I'll just put a little bit in there, just a hint. Just dropping in some shapes. I'll have to refine them a little bit. Getting a little dry. This is going on lighter, but it will darken up once it starts to dry. It will help me build my texture. Just kind of dust it on for now. I may give it a real thin coat of white at the very end. Okay, let's let that dry. We're getting there. Okay, let's work on our shadow a little bit. There's some reflected light right in here, and then also I'm going to take out the edges a little bit further, but I'm going to make them a different value, because if you look real close you can kind of see a double shadow of reflected light. There's a line inside and then another line outside, and then it fades in. We're going to try and do that fade, and then I'm also going to take this a little wee bit darker directly under the ball and make it a little bit deeper. In fact, I will mix some deeper gray for that. And I'm using a smaller brush only because I want to control the amount of paint I put down. Just a little bit at a time, and that makes it easier to blend, and it's actually a time saver in the long run. Right now we're going to mix up, we're going to take some of this gray. We're going to take a little bit of blue, a little bit of burnt umber, French ultramarine. Make this a little bit darker. I'm going to put this right at the very point of where the ball is actually going to be touching. And then I'll feather this out again. And what I want to do is take more of this color out, and that's what I'll use to feather it into what's already there. Right now it just looks like a gray disc, and that's it. Again, I have my paper towel ready to go. Just to help a little bit, I'll take some of that pre-mixed color into that. Because it's a smaller area, I'll be able to mix it kind of like oils, for lack of better words, while it's still wet. But again, this may not be the only coat we give this. It depends on what final outcome you want, whether you want it painterly, a little bit of texture, or if you want a softer blend. Okay, now we're going to take some of the darker, and then we're going to get some of this out. I'm going to expand that shadow out a little bit. And again, as long as I have these colors pre-mixed, it helps a lot that you could pick up right where you left off if you're obviously working with the same color. Kind of a little bit of a both right now, but I want a subtle line there anyway where the two are meeting. Add a little bit of water. Okay, we'll have to go over that one more time. It's starting to soften up a little bit though. And you can see the dry brush work. I'm just kind of dusting it around, pushing it around, trying to even it up, get it to my finished point as quick as possible. And then this right in here, I'm going to put now my medium gray back over this area right in here, just to lighten it up a little bit, just for some reflected light. And I could always take that pre-mixed dark color back into it. That's why it's a really good idea to mix some of your colors. Very subtle color change there. Glazing over, you can take just a little wee bit at a time down. By smudging it, I'm getting rid of my brush strokes, and that's what I want. However you need to do it, that's fine. But once I get to a point, I can't wipe any more off. So if I'm trying to remove it and I can't, my humble opinion means that it's there to stay. Okay. Very subtle change. We could do that again. Even maybe take this a little wee bit darker. There's a dark spot in here too. I'll leave this dry a little bit, and then we'll go up to the ball now. Once this dries a little bit, I'm going to put another edge around here and blend it into the medium blue. Right now, let's see what we could do here. We can get rid of that. I'm going to go ahead and break out the raw umber and the unbleached titanium. This side has to go darker, so we're going to take it as dark as this. So I'm going to mix up again a little bit more deeper gray. I'm going to hit that just with water, just real quick. Okay, I'm going to clean the brush off now just because I'm painting a fairly small area, so I'm just going to take a little bit of paint at a time. Again, I want it to run out as I go towards the top. There's a little bit of a reflection down in here, but I'm going to go ahead and start it just a little bit dark. Okay, there we go. And now I want to, this arc right in here is a little wee bit too perfect. I'd like to just stagger it a little bit. It comes down in here a little bit, comes down in here a little bit. And that's only because the ball is not perfectly round anymore. If you'd actually see it, there is a little bit of deformity to it. Again, we could take our lighter colors back over this, which we will, because we have to put our white spots in here, and then I'm going to go back over the strings, because the strings are only one solid color. I'll put a very subtle shadow in some of them, and then are also double stitched, so there could be a line in between two of them if you want to get really fine. While I have that heavy gray mixed, put in some more holes for the strings. Not all of them, just some of them. Ones you can actually see into. Okay, and here's my titanium white thin. I'll just leave it right here. And what I'm going to do is put in, while my shadow's drying, start my highlights. Very subtle, and you can see that once I put it down, once it starts to dry, it's going to darken. So it's just the opposite of watercolors. Okay, let's give a little bit of life to our strings. And I'm pulling the bristles so that's more or less now a small chisel, small bright. Very little paint. Don't want to try and blend out a big gob of paint. It ain't coming off, so if it's too light, I'll have to tone it back down again with a little bit of raw umber and unbleached titanium. And here's where I could diffuse a little bit of the contrast if I need to. Okay, let's let that dry. We'll go back for round 2. Okay, I'm going to work on this section right in here a little bit, make it a little bit darker. Once that dries, then I'll bring this reflection up into here, just a little bit. Okay, let's straighten out this shadow a little bit. I think it's dry enough. I'll leave that dry first and then give it one more coat of real light. Might be able to put my lighter colors down there now. Again, I could go back over this with a little bit of darker colors if I want to pull out some more texture. Very subtle. Okay, let's let that dry. We'll see where we're at. I'm going to make this a little bit more white and then white over here. We could do that right now. My background is bleeding through a little wee bit up on top, and I'm going to eliminate that right now so there's no ghost image. You can have a soft edge here or a hard edge, depends on what you want. Soft edge sometimes looks more three-dimensional, but a hard edge kind of jumps out at you more, and when you see the painting, it definitely jumps on at you. Okay, we'll let that dry. And now, just to give you background information, the photograph is on a white paper. So yes, in our reference, there is a nice white reflection underneath the sphere. However, we changed it to blue. So I don't want to leave it looking white-ish. I definitely want to make it a little bit of a blue-gray cast. The ball itself is not very a highly reflective object, so I'll just give a subtle blue, but I will lighten it up some just to give it that spherical shape. Otherwise, I just don't want it white though, because there's no white that it is sitting on. We're going to work on these strings here a little bit. We're going to make this darker right in here, and we'll do that next. We're going to start with this. Pretty much keep the colors I use most often together and how I mix them. But with the jars, it's really nice that you could just take out any that you want and use them as you need them. And you can see how much paint I'm using at a time. This is a smaller painting, but you're still pretty much only using what you need. Again, I'm going to clean the brush off because there's way too much paint on it for all that I want to put down. And that will help me on how I'm putting it down. Okay, we're going to take this up into here. I'm going to mist it down just a little bit. It's a little bit too dry. And again, some of these shapes have to do with marks on the ball. Okay. We'll make this a little bit darker right in here. Again, if you take it a little bit at a time, it's doable. With the glazing technique of acrylics, taking your values just a little difference at a time sounds like a long, lengthy procedure, but you're actually getting to your end result much quicker. This saves time in the end, providing nice, smooth blending. Okay, let's take a little wash of just a light grayish blue on the bottom, just to give it a subtle value of blue. I'm going to use this one right here. And it will change a little bit because of the colors behind it will be coming through. This will kill the white, so to speak. But if you want a nice vivid color, you pretty much have to start with white first, otherwise the colors below it may create and optical contamination, if you will. Okay, let's let that dry. Okay, let's start cleaning it up a little bit. Now just say, for example, if I wanted to take this darker, I want to take it a little bit darker, but then I want it to go up into here the way the photograph is. So all I have to do is remove a little bit of this. And this is just going to be like a typical correction. Now what we'll do is we'll white some of this out a little bit and then replace it back and feather in the raw umbers and the burnt umber a little bit and even the unbleached titanium. But first I'm going to get rid of a little bit of this white here. I'm going to just cut it back. So I am going to take my colors that I need. Should probably be these right here. Fish that white out. Trying to leave a little bit of the white behind where my highlight is. But I don't need as much white that's there. I'm going to add a little bit of water. Very subtle changes. Okay, now I'm going to make this darker right in here. I'm going to take it up in here and then I'll just take a little wee bit of that out. Okay, and then I'm going to make this darker. Go a little bit darker than it is. Okay, now I whited out my highlights. Once they dry a little bit, then I'll just give them a real subtle glaze of either the unbleached titanium and then maybe a little bit of raw umber, just so they're not pure white. We cut that back a little bit. I can make this a little wee bit darker, and that might be it. I could give the strings a little bit more character. Some of these holes are a little bit on the elliptical side from pulling tight, stretching the leather. I'm just applying real small amounts of paint at a time with a dry brush. And that'll loan itself to that shaggy leather texture. That will just about disappear though once it dries. Put a little bit more light blue in here. There's even a shape right in here where the reflected light's sneaking in underneath the ball. Barely noticeable. That's the same thing over here too. We'll give it a little bit. And again, that's why it's really nice to have these colors pre-mixed. Go right back to them. Not a question of whether you can mix the colors or not. It's a question of whether or not you can mix the exact color. Again, I'm putting real small amounts of paint down just to reduce the contrast of any gobby areas I might have. This one is almost done. I'll put a little wee bit if we got it. We'll let that dry and see what we have. We might be done. Okay, let's go ahead and finish this one up. What I'm going to do is just two major changes here, and that is I'm going to soften up the edge of the shadow just a little bit more, make it a little bit bigger, take it out into here and then around, and then I'll diffuse the edge even more. And then I'm also going to cut back a little bit on the reflected light underneath, only because we're going from white to a light to medium blue, so it's not going to be reflected as much as the picture. So going by the photo would be one thing if we kept everything as the photo was, but since we didn't, I'm going to make those changes. First, let's work with the shadow. I got the colors out. We're going to go ahead, get some of this paint out. I'll start by mixing both of them together. And again, in some cases, paint will go down lighter than what it is and then dry a little bit darker. So you'll notice that if you put down the exact same color after it's already dry. One note about my acrylics: ever since I started the jar method long ago, I never looked back. It works exceptional to hold the paints just as good as the original tubes. I have had colors in the jars for years unaffected. Now this depends a lot on the type of jar you use, but when you have the colors pre-mixed and set aside, you could always use them for other paintings and even remix them to a different value. Okay, I think that's it. Let's stop and take a look and see what we got. Okay, let's see what we have. Now, the one great thing about acrylics is that you could never be done if you don't want to be. You can always take your lights back over darks, darks back over lights, and just keep going back and forth till you minimize the amount of contrast an object has. If I thought this was too much over here, then I could dust some white back over it and just eliminate some of that contrast of the harder shapes, depending on what you want. Now, as far as the background goes, we used a Ocello sponge, this one right here, and I just rounded it just to show you what you can do if you want to. But then if we would have used a sponge such as this, which is a car sponge, soft grip car sponge, it has a real close sail structure to it that would have given us a real smooth transition, or went the complete opposite direction and use a natural sponge. They vary quite a bit in texture, that then you could go ahead and create a stronger texture that even if you want a streaky texture, then you could pretty much blend the colors with a slight pull, and that will give you a linear pattern if you need it, whether it be for trees in the background of a landscape. If you want some kind of linear pattern, then that would be a good way to start your patterns, and that would kill the white, so to speak, of the canvas. Now with this one, I would pretty much consider it done. If I do any more detail, like the real small white dots that are throughout the leather, then I would have to do more detail to the strings and a little bit of everything. Otherwise, the other areas may not look finished if you put too much detail in one area and not enough everywhere else. So with all that said, I hope you got something out of this acrylic demo. I will constantly refer back to this particular demo in all of my acrylic demos coming up. That way, if you are just starting from scratch, this might be a good starting point before you dive into a more serious painting. So, until I see you out in the field or back at the studio, thanks for watching.